My name is Aido Lakota. I'm the former political editor of Sowetan. I'm currently operating as an independent media practitioner. I'm your MC today. This colloquium takes place at the time when the global geopolitics is changing from a unipolar world order, historically dominated by Western superpowers, to multilateralism. This multilateralism calls upon all citizens of the world to play their role in creating an egalitarian world based on the principles of socio-economic justice. Most importantly, this call is not only made to the so-called world leaders, but all sectors of society, including the media, to put their shoulders to the wheel in building the envisioned new world order. As a former chairman of the now defunct Forum of Black Journalists, which was a platform then created by black journalists for them to engage with key role players, including politicians, business people, labor, churches, in enhancing our nascent democracy. I believe that today's event is a move in the right direction. It is in this context that I'm going to invite to the podium the organizer of this event, a well-known activist, a journalist, Mr. Mpigeli Duma, to come and give some opening remarks and further expatiate about this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon, everyone. As the Program Director said, my name is Mpigeli Duma. I'm a journalist and a media activist. Also, I worked as a journalist at the Sowetan, which was, of course, very much a centerpiece of intellectual black resistance. Few are left that have not abandoned any intellectuality to consumerism. We got inspiration from the 1970s black journalists, which they call themselves the Union of Black Journalists, UBJ, who held meetings during the night at the surgery of Dr. Ntato Motlane to discuss the political direction of the world newspaper and unfolding events in the country. Ndate Fanyani Mazibuko is still alive today, told us that George Walcope used to call these meetings umcimbi. Umcimbi, loosely translated, is gatherings. It's an African language that means gatherings in isiXhosa. Percy Koboza, Agritlaste, Tom Mantata, Sidupi Ramakgopa, Castro Mayatula, and Kenny Rachidi were among one of the journalists and community leaders who attended umcimbi. Ndate Mazibuko and Ndate Ramakgopa are still alive today. They always testify to this type of umcimbis. In October 1977, when the apartheid government banned 19 black consciousness organizations and 2 newspapers, historically this year and now it is October, a few days before, there's a remembrance of what we call a Media Day, others call Media Day, Black Wednesday, They have different names. All of them, these comrades who held some meetings, or this meeting they call it Umcimbi, were detained and sent to Modebi prison. This tradition of Umcimbi continued at the Sowetan newspaper, particularly at Industrial 61 Commando Road, where opinion makers were invited to share their views with journalists on global issues. It is in this tradition today that we have invited the ambassador of the Russian Federation in South Africa to this colloquium to share with us the changing geopolitical dynamics. The invitation was extended to the embassy around June 13, 2023, this year. In this context, BRICS will be fundamentally to the new international system if Africans understand that we hold the balance in the international political economy. We are holding this Mcimbi, the gathering, to use the word of the ancestors of the 70s, at the market photo workshop, because this place introduced dynamic photographers, and it is part of the ecosystem of progressive journalism. In the current phase, we are moving out of neoliberalism to the weaponization of everything. It will be sealed by the escalation of the wars in Ukraine. The Russian Federation calls it a special military operation. We have to be sharp, Bantu Baseka, we have to be sharp. The African Revolution is upon us. Thank you, Mr. Program Director.
Thank you, Mr. Duma. Without wasting much time, I'm going to call upon Dr. Kanyiso Mava Mbulawa, who is a medical doctor that trained in the Soviet Union. He is also the chairman of the Soviet and Russian Alumni Association, which comprises graduates, former graduates from the Soviet and Russia. He is here to introduce the Russian ambassador.
Very much, Program Director. Colleagues, as has been said, I am a graduate of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 1987, Petrus Lumumba Friendship University, humbly before you. My task is the easiest, I believe, at the same time a very difficult task. The easy part of it is just announcing the introduction of the ambassador of the Russian Federation. The difficult part of it is that this particular person is in actual fact representing a large measure of the international dynamics in geopolitics today. His presence in our midst today is to assist us to understand from the original source what it is in the view of the Russian Federation that is driving us in and into what future the world is going into. We all know that we are on the brink of something. It must be acknowledged that Russia as a country is playing a role that is of necessity important for us that we cannot ignore. Whether it is a good role or a bad role, this is where the media and your esteemed selves come into play. The media in the world today exists very much to influence the thinking of the whole population, world population, the little village, our global village of humanity. The media can play a positive role, but the media can also manipulate the thinking of the population, the people who do not have access to the news, to the actual events. So this particular event, which is correctly called a colloquium, that is interrogating the reality, looking for the truth, is of great importance in the context of the role, the vital role that the media plays. Our views are in your hands. The views of the simple and the most access, the people with the most access to anything. I know because they switch on the news and they listen to what the latest news is, and that news comes from you, colleagues. Господин посол, это мое большое удовлетворение, это с большой честью, что я вас приглашаю на подиум, и будем от вас сегодня получить, наверное, последние мнения, знания, расширить свое мировоззрение о ситуации в геополитике на сегодняшний день. Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency Mr. Ilya Igorovich Rogachev, Ambassador Plenipotentiary, Extraordinaire and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of South Africa and the Kingdom of Lesotho. A round of hands, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you for coming here. I'll do my best, but you know everything. You know everything better than I do. You make the news. I will just try to inject, some kind of not so obvious knowledge about what's going on in the world, and I will reflect mostly on the conflict, the situation, the difficult situation around Ukraine, and I will try to look at the current events in the world through that prism of what's going on in and with Ukraine. Now, of course, it is an honor for me to be here. I'm humbled because of the influence that, in fact, modern media have on the people's minds and on the real situation on the ground in the world in general. You are the, how do they put it, the fourth power, the fifth power, and I'm pretty much sure that in recent history, role of the media in wartime was very big, very important, but it's only growing. And it is really an influencing factor in everything what is taking place in the world. If I turn to Ukraine, to Ukrainian situation, the first feature of the information war, as we call it, we think that the struggle between narratives has become part of the war, and there is this struggle of propaganda, counter-propaganda, the narratives that different sides try to inject into people's minds, and unfortunately, Russian Federation does not have the same means, and I've heard from many people, from many of your colleagues, that we Russians are losing the information war. It is perhaps so, but I will do my best and try to shift the balance in our favor. I am doing my best, and in particular tonight, this is a very valuable opportunity for me to do so, to try to achieve this, even locally. So the main feature of this situation, of the narrative and counter-narrative struggle around Ukraine, was that special military operation, SMO, that Russia carries out in Ukraine is absolutely unjustified, without any reason, aggression. And from the day one, you could hear that these exactly words, unjustified without any reason. Now, the narrative is now changing. You could hear different officials, Western officials, you could hear Ukrainian officials telling you that in the context that is in their favor, that the military assistance to Ukraine should be going on, because there is so much more than Ukraine that is at stake. So the first question, this is not logical. A year and a half ago, a year ago, half a year ago, you were saying exactly the opposite. That there is nothing at stake. There is just, bloodthirsty Russian leader and these bloody Russians who just attacked their neighbors because they want to expand their empire and so on, take somebody's lands, chase some people from their historical lands and so on. And now it's like the completely opposite. That they're hinting to something much more important that's going on. Not just natural Russian aggression. So I would like to ask some of the people who state that, who were writing about that. So when were you lying? Then or now? And where is the truth for the rest of us? Well, of course, to those who know history, and history is not taught very well in many places these days, and this is not an omission, I believe. So for those who know history, it is obvious that the roots of the current situation in Ukraine, they go far deep in history. And perhaps one should begin with the period just after the Second World War, when Nazi regime was defeated, but people, the carriers of the ideology, the bureaucrats, the military, the special service people, scientists in different areas, were harbored exactly for their knowledge, exactly for being the bearers of a certain ideology. It is interesting that a very stupid but by nature a criminal episode that took place in the Canadian Parliament recently, when in Canada, one of the beacons of democracy, so to speak, a member of the anti-Hitler coalition during the Second World War, they honored a volunteer. This is to be stressed, a person who volunteered to fight in the Waffen-SS division Galicia. And though those were the most bloodthirsty and cruel executioners of all the dirty, unhuman policies that were executed during the Second World War by the Hitlerite regime. And he participated in it voluntarily. Now, of course, in the parliament, he was greeted as somebody who fought against the Russians during the Second World War. And this is interesting, again, because no parliamentarians protested against that. No parliamentarians have walked out in protest. Nobody objected to this. It might seem strange, but of course people should know that fighting against Russians during the Second World War, fighting against the USSR, you must have been part of the so-called Axis. Rome, Mussolini regime, Berlin, Nazi regime, and Tokyo, militaristic Japanese regime at that time. And so fighting against Russians meant fighting on the side of this famous political regimes. It is strange, but it looked like this very simple knowledge, simple thought didn't come to any of the minds of the Canadian parliamentarians. Now, of course, it's not because they didn't know. It was because that's part of the policy. Now, everything that is anti-Russian is good for the West, for the Western democracy. So, this is why we hear so many times, repeatedly, over and over again, for more than a year and a half, that there are no Nazism in Ukraine. There is one of the goals of the SMO, that is denazification of Ukraine, is a completely false slogan put forward by the Russians. Well, now, no, it is not like that. They do not like it because it runs against their policies. Again, I'm turning back to some the distant past, but after the Second World War, you know, there were already plans nurtured by Winston Churchill to start a new war against the USSR just after the Second World War ended. But he was not supported in that by many other leaders, including as we know, by the then American president. But apparently these anti-Soviet and anti-Russian moods were brewing already in the UK, in the head of their prime minister, who in 1946 already came up with his famous Fulton speech, where he outlaid new policies vis-à-vis the USSR, the very recent ally in the bloodiest war in humankind history. And according to some reports, more than 8,000 people from Galicia division were harbored in the UK, and they were used to instigate anti-Soviet moods in Western Ukraine, in Ukraine in general, and they were sent to the USSR. under disguise with different legends. It didn't work though. It didn't work well because the so-called Banderites, the Nazi collaborators who remained in Ukraine and abroad, they were defeated in the territory of the former USSR. They were defeated in Western Ukraine. It was a bloody struggle, I must tell you, but it was finished basically by 1954. So after that, these former Galicia division members, fighters, were considered not so useful anymore, and they were sent to other countries, to Canada, to the United States in particular. And besides that, this is just an episode in the large overall program that was implemented by the Western countries the same years on harboring former Nazi criminals who, instead of being judged by the Nuremberg Tribunal or other tribunals, and instead of incurring some responsibility for their horrendous deeds, were saved. And they had, many of them that had their identities changed, and they were used and considered useful in many respects in these countries, in particular in the Western Germany, in United States itself. Now many people have heard about the General Gelen, who used to be the head of one of the most powerful and influential special services in serving Hitler. He then became a loyal serviceman to the United States of America. And it is the appearance of the CIA, actually in 1947, has to do a lot with his influence, with his knowledge, how to put together special services, how to conduct special operations, covert operations, and so on and so forth. So there were many people like that who either were harbored and taken physically directly from European military theater, or emigrated through neutral Switzerland using Swiss passports, and so on and so on. Now these stories emerge, and they became more and more meaningful, actual in the present world, because Nazi ideology, unfortunately, has not disappeared with Hitler and his immediate collaborators, and was not, unfortunately, terminated by the Nuremberg trial. It was there. It remained there. It remained hidden for many years, but it re-emerged when it was deemed useful by some Western leaders, by Western elites. So then we can go back to Ukraine and try to follow through the development of Nazi ideology, the evolution of the society in this direction in Ukraine itself. And of course, the major push to that process was provided by a 2014 unconstitutional coup. And so some commentators and many observers were surprised because it was, even from the seemingly, like on the surface, even from the Western point of view, it was not necessary. Opposition was winning. The then Ukrainian President Yanukovych, who actually was recognized as legitimate president by everybody, including in the West, and his election has never been contested, agreed to the transfer of power, basically, to the peaceful transfer of power. He was pressured from all sides not to use violence, and law enforcement bodies did not use violence during the Maidan. But there was a big provocation, very characteristic to such kind of situations, when unknown sharpshooters started killing people who protested on the streets, shooting in their backs. So the heavenly 100, as Ukrainians call their victims, were shot by some unknown snipers from the roofs, from the rooftops of surrounding buildings, structures, and it was somewhere around 100 people who lost their lives. But again, law enforcement people were given orders not to recur to arms, not to use violence. This story is very graphic because exactly the same happened some 12 years prior to that in Vilnius, in Lithuania. Exactly the same happened in Syria. Exactly the same happened in Egypt. So it is there is something to think about. Whether it is just a combination of random factors, situations that lead to this, or this is an algorithm that is being used somehow by somebody. So the date of the elections was moved closer to this Maidan protest in Ukraine, and it was absolutely clear that President Yanukovych was going to lose these elections. So all this, the packaged agreement was put on paper, and the agreement signed by Ukrainian authorities, legitimate Ukrainian authorities, and protesters, and they were guaranteed. These agreements were guaranteed by several European foreign ministers: Poland, Germany, France. And the next day, in 24 hours, they were trampled by the opposition, who started occupying governmental buildings in central Kyiv. And these protesters, driven by ultra-nationalists, neo-Nazis, took power basically in Kyiv and announced their program of action, their priorities, and the highest priority was to fight everything Russian, and they promised to begin with prohibiting Russian language in Ukraine, where, according to the polls, 80% of the population were thinking in Russian, and some 70-75% spoke Russian at home among themselves, though considered themselves ethnically Russian, less than 30%. But clearly that the Russian was the language of majority of the population at that time. So it was minority that imposed its views, its policies on majority through an unconstitutional seizure of power And people in many other parts of Ukraine, in the east and in the south, populated predominantly with ethnic Russians, said that this is not what they expect, not what they wanted to happen. And protests begin in several places in the east and in the south, in particularly in Donbass, in particularly in Crimea, in Odessa. And the putschists reacted to that in a certain way. They mobilized their supporters in western Ukraine and armed them and sent them to different eastern and southern regions to crush the protests. They called they put them in trains and sent the trains in different directions from Kiev, and cynically called these trains friendship trains. And this is how the blood was spilled in the south and in the east of Ukraine. And using some tactics, people in Crimea isolated themselves from the rest of Ukraine and had a referendum. You know the results, 96% or 97% came to vote of the overall voters, registered voters, and 96+% voted in favor of rejoining with Russia. And in other places, people were not so successful. In Odessa, in particular, the peaceful demonstrators were driven into a structure, the so-called trade union house, and it was torched, and 48 people burned alive, and trying to jump out of the windows, and the crowd of neo-Nazis rushed to finish them. There is still no investigation of this crime, though there are dozens of videos on the internet taken by the witnesses. So in Odessa in particular, in the other southern regions, except for Crimea, protests were suppressed. In the eastern part of Crimea, in Donbass, though, it gradually evolved into the latent conflict. It escalated till the point when new authorities in Kiev sent their army to crush the protesters, Russian-speaking protests. They used artillery, they used military aircraft, they used military, all kinds of armored vehicles, including tanks. That was a war, that was a civil war, started by a regime in Kiev against its own population, and this is what led to the events in Ukraine, in the eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. And we can often hear arguments about that Russia did not use all the peaceful means that were at its disposal. It could have been solved diplomatically. Well, we tried. We did everything we could. In fact, in Minsk, some agreements were negotiated in several stages. And finally, the so-called Minsk II agreements emerged, which provided actually for the peaceful solution of Ukraine. By the way, it provided also for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, well, except for Crimea, where referendum had already taken place. And just a certain autonomy for the regions like Donbass, for Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, in accordance with the existing documents, conventions, international treaties signed under the auspices of United Nations, Council of Europe, OSCE. So legal obligations and commitments were there in order to for the population to use the protection they would provide. But Ukraine violated all of them. All these documents related to the rights of ethnic minorities, to the rights of regional or minority languages, to cultural rights, to preservation of historical monuments, and so on, of minorities. Everything was violated, and we never heard a protest on the Western side, except for some very noble and brave individuals. But Western policies were just to instigate this evolution further, to suppress Russian population, to introduce basically the regime that would a regime of discrimination against people on the basis of ethnicity. That is racial discrimination. Now, as we know, by the declarations, self-stripping, I would call them, declarations by some Western leaders, in particularly French President François Hollande, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and a few other people, that the Minsk agreements were negotiated in order not to preserve peace in Ukraine and to stop this bloody conflict, but just in order to provide time to supply, to train and supply Ukrainian army with arms, so they would resolve this so-called Russian question by force. And that we could not afford, of course. And our president said very clearly, many years ago, that we will not allow this to happen. We will not allow to resolve the issue in the east of Ukraine by violence. So for more than 8 years, the conflict that remained largely unnoticed, very unfortunately, by the rest of the world, that is in the east of Ukraine, when the parts of the territories of Donetsk region and Lugansk region were controlled by, as they were called, pro-Russian separatists, people who protested for the right to be able speaking Russian, be allowed to read in Russian, for their kids to be taught in Russian, speaking Russian language schools, and so on, and the Ukrainian government that was appropriated by these ultranationalist and Nazi minority. And these territories were shelled and bombed almost daily. I mean, there are just several weeks, perhaps during all this period of time of 8 years, when there were no blasts, some covert operations carried out by Ukrainian military in these territories, killing some of the Russian-speaking leaders, local power people on this city, municipal level, and so on. When the infrastructure, like water pipes, water substations, electricity generating facilities were destroyed. it went on and on and on, and unfortunately, the world media didn't speak about it. This is a very important feature again, because this is how public opinion is being created, being manipulated, perhaps I should say. Nobody counted exactly the dead. Now, a colleague of mine, a Ukrainian ambassador here in South Africa, Lyubov Abravitova, she likes to go public with her statements and some written pieces, and she often uses this number that she often mentions, that some 12 to 14,000 people in the east of Ukraine were killed, and she never says who killed whom. But most of them, 12,000 out of 14 or so, are peaceful Ukrainian population. Their only shortcoming, their only fault is that they speak Russian, and they wanted to speak Russian, to keep speaking Russian. So, unfortunately, again, that was going on, and the Ukrainian military were becoming stronger and stronger. Every few weeks, a new battalion trained by NATO instructors, armed and equipped with NATO standards arms and equipment, joined Ukrainian military forces, Ukrainian army. They were growing in strength, and they were becoming more and more aggressive. In the few weeks prior to the beginning of the special military operation, shelling and bombing of Donetsk and Lugansk intensified. And very clearly, the attack on these eastern Ukrainian territories was imminent, and it had to be prevented, and it was prevented. Hence, these situation with the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine, which has a very deep, a very long historical roots, became an immediate cause for the special military operation. So that's an immediate reason, so to speak. But there are others, because Ukraine is just part of the, just a piece, an element of a global strategic security arrangement. And could it be that no military operation would be carried on in Ukraine? But of course, yes. Of course. Not only Minsk agreements that were supported, guaranteed again by the Western leaders, that were adopted, approved by the UN Security Council, actually unanimously. Not only this that I have in mind when I speak about how could the conflict, armed conflict, be averted. How could this situation be diffused before it gets to open hostilities? And it could, because in December 2021 there was, so to speak, last-minute diplomatic effort on the Russian side when you should remember this, it was discussed in the world press, but under completely different source. Russian Federation has proposed to Washington, to the United States, and to NATO to conclude 2 treaties on mutual security guarantees that would have prevented, the implementation of which would have prevented a special military operation. They would have made it unnecessary. And strategically, there are several things that were mentioned in these that were targeted, to be resolved as security interests on both sides in these treaties, and they were simply laughed off. Now that was quite something to me as a diplomat, and it mattered much more to me than perhaps non-diplomats, because it is absolutely clear that a serious proposal emanating from a big state with powerful military, with nuclear arms, on the issue of war and peace, basically, of peace and security, should be taken very seriously. Just this mere fact by, formal grounds that I have enumerated. It wasn't considered, nobody discussed it with us. Nobody expressed any, to whom the two treaties were addressed. No, nobody took it seriously, and they were just brushed aside. And hence the very last diplomatic effort, a letter that our foreign minister, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, wrote to his Western counterparts already in January 2022, asking them and reminding them and asking them how it should be implemented. And the issue in question was the arrangement that was for many, many years negotiated in the organization on the on cooperation and security in Europe and the OSCE. That is the arrangement that says basically that no country should ensure its security at the expense of the security interests of other countries. So how about that? Because apparently, as we felt it, and we had again all the grounds to feel it that way, security in Europe was ensured at the expense of the Russian Federation, at the expenses of our security interests. And here we can go back to such issues as NATO expansion. And of course there was a promise not to expand NATO, not to move NATO 1 inch, as it was said. It was promised to the first and the last Soviet president Mikhail Gorbachev on many occasions, and there are now evidence that was with lots of pain and difficulties found and provided to the public by some researchers. Of course, we have plenty of documents. I remember myself at that time, 1991, I served in the legal department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I saw plenty of papers, minutes of protocols of different meetings, the highest level, the level of ministers, where our counterparts said that no expansion to the east by the NATO. So that was one thing. Another one was that United States persistently left several very important bilateral and multilateral treaties in the area of arms control, disarmament. They used to call it disarmament and arms control. And again, Western press, media didn't react to that. World media almost didn't react to that the way these events deserved it. Just like now, the CTBT treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that our president said we should follow the steps of the United States and call off our ratification of this treaty. And there is, there is a spike of indignation in the Western media. How can Russians do that? Oh, this is a manifestation of a very aggressive policy, proof that Russia is going to use the nuclear weapons and so on. But United States have never ratified it. And you never indignated about that. So there were several such occasions in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Apparently United States and the allies wanted to have their hands free in using all kinds of weaponry, modern weaponry. And then such, maybe even less noticeable but not less important elements, like if you compare strategic doctrinal documents by NATO bloc, how they evolved during these last decades, you would see that they have become, they were becoming more and more aggressive, and more sharpened and pointed against Russia. The ceiling of the use of nuclear weapons in particular has been formulated in a manner that allowed the use at a lower and lower level of situations. Now, I understand that in many countries, in particular here in South Africa, most of the population does not care about NATO's strategy. But we had to pay attention to this, and we had to be vigilant, and we had to notice that. We had to take this into account. Putting together all these factors, the picture was becoming gloomier and gloomier, more dangerous for us. The infrastructure, NATO infrastructure, military, was moved to our borders physically. I mean physically. The anti-missile installations, installations that belong to the anti-missile defense system, appeared in the neighboring countries, in Poland in particular. And when we asked American, at that time, partners, as we used to call them, what is the reason for that? They say, oh, no, don't worry, it's not against you, it's against Iran. For God's sake, Iran didn't have and doesn't have missiles of that range. So to launch them to the west, northwest, and so for them to be shot down over Poland. So it was nonsense. It was absolute profanation of diplomatic negotiations. Now, new installations appeared in Romania, and they were about to appear in Ukraine properly. We know that some units of the US Army, in particular armed with the cruise missiles, were supposed to be stationed, yes, on a rotational basis in Ukraine, but rotational means that there is always somebody, though it's not the same people, but a unit is always there. And the works have already begun in some of the Black Sea Ukrainian port cities to host actually NATO naval installations. So for us, from that perspective, it was really menacing, because cruise missile would take like 5 minutes or so to reach Moscow, our capital, from the territory of Ukraine. And this is the time when no anti-missile defense can be activated, actually. So from strategic point of view, we would have been completely defenseless. And we tried again and again, bilaterally, through Russia-NATO summits and Russia-NATO Council, to draw attention of our former partners that this is not acceptable to us, that NATO expansion to such former Soviet republics like Georgia and Ukraine is unacceptable. This is the red line. And many very clear and sound warnings have been made. In particular, I would refer you to the speech of our president, Vladimir Putin, at the 2007 Munich Security Conference. To me personally, he repeated the things he said then on many occasions. But for some reason, this is, in the West, this is considered to be like a cornerstone intervention by our president when he said that no is no. And there were people in the West actually who shared this view and who understood this and who warned the highest authorities about all the consequences, possible consequences of NATO expansion in particular. And one of them was a former ambassador of the US in Moscow, and now he is head of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Вылетел из головы его фамилия. Yes, Mr. Burns, who presumably in 2008 wrote a cable to Washington that was called NET, means нет. No means no, where he warned that expansion of NATO to Ukraine is a red line to Russia, and that all the cleavages, all the views in the political elite would merge at one point, that this is unacceptable and that it should be prevented even by war. And presumably he wrote this in the spring, and in the fall of 2008, NATO summit took decision to expand NATO to Georgia, to Ukraine actually. So, of course, in this context, that world media do not want to talk about, that these events, again, the promise not to expand NATO is being, mocked at as a Russian-born anecdote, a Kremlin propaganda, and when you produce these facts, they just brushed aside like Kremlin propaganda. No, we had a very difficult context. We had to take a very difficult decision. Some part of the Russian society, yes, was and remains misled by the Western narratives. But most of the people understand, maybe genetically, they do not trust the West, and they support the actions that have been undertaken in order to ensure the strategic security guarantees of the Russian Federation and to protect the Russian-speaking people abroad. So this is what's going on in Ukraine, and it should be considered just as one piece in the puzzle of global strategic security. And it's not for the sake of, loving ethnic Ukrainians that the whole West has united around them. Now about 50 states supply arms and different kind of assistance, financial assistance to Ukraine. The total number in this year and a half or so has exceeded already by far 170 billion US dollars. Just imagine how much could have been done if this money was spent otherwise for the speediest achieving of Millennium Development Goals and Agenda 2030, 2063 African Agenda, and so on and so on. Just energy transition, development of green energy, alleviating extreme poverty and hunger in the world. But no, they are spent to arm Ukraine, to prolong the conflict. And again, the goal is not being hidden. Many officials, very high-ranking officials in the West, including some US senators, I think, mentioned and shared this view that investing in Ukraine, which allows to kill Russians, is the best investment they could have made. I quote as precisely as I remember. Ukraine is suffering, Ukrainian military are suffering terrible casualties. And nobody cares about them. Nobody cares in the West. And for years prior to the SMO, on Russian TV and radio, political commentators, all these talking heads on political talk shows, with the participation of our former Ukrainian brothers, have been warning Ukrainians that the West, Americans, will fight Russia till the last Ukrainian soldier. And this is exactly what's happening. Exactly. Now, when the so-called and very much publicized Ukrainian spring counteroffensive that actually began in June is out of breath and they have no more reserves, the Westerners, beginning with the Minister of Defense of the UK, demand from Ukrainians to mobilize everybody they can mobilize. In several consecutive waves of mobilization, Ukrainians have mobilized already all of the able-bodied men, and they have started recruiting people who normally should not make a military service. There are consequences already. I think that the embassy, wrote in on our Twitter that there was a case already when a schizophrenic shot 5 of his fellows, Ukrainian military men, and 3 more were wounded or something like that. So now there is talk about total mobilization. Will that help them? No. And militarily we will win. We are winning. And this military ending is getting closer and closer. But again, here the narrative in the world media, in the Western media, the motive is that Russia is losing, and you could hear that for more than a year, maybe a year and a half. Now it has changed. If you are attentive, you will see more and more such phrases like Ukrainians have won a moral victory. Well, in the absence of other results, what can you talk about? Moral victory? No, of course not. And you could have heard that Russians do not want to fight, that Russian soldiers are stupid officers, drunk, incapable, that the engines of armored vehicles would not start, that half of the Russian ballistic missile will not fly, and so on and so on. And all this crap, but all this serves just one purpose: to prolong the conflict, to harm Russia as much as possible, because from the other side, the purpose is, well, it was to defeat Russia. You could remember how many times very high-ranking officials, including President Biden, including NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, have said that Russia should be defeated on the battlefield, that we should inflict, we should hand Russia a defeat, it's a strategic defeat, and so on and so on. So they really have engaged in this up to the nostrils, and they sit in this now, and they don't know how to find the way out of it, and there are some signs of panic in the Western ranks. But while they can, they will keep sending Ukrainians to certain death. And of course, there were economic sanctions introduced quite some time ago, and the purpose was, unlike what they say now, that the West is not fighting Russian people, it's the regime, or even one person, President Putin in Kremlin, one person in Kremlin who the West is fighting against. But no, of course, economic sanctions were introduced in order to make people suffer economically, and to vote President Putin out of power. And this didn't happen, and this will not happen. Of course, for those who follow closely Russian policies, Russian politics, political situation internally, who know or understand just a little bit Russian national character, the way we're thinking and feeling, these people are certain that this will not happen. This is just absurdity. It's absolutely impossible, and the result would be actually the opposite. And polls show that President Putin enjoys an unprecedented level of support, just like at another spike when referendum in Crimea took place in 2014. So, nevertheless, the propaganda machine is working. Everything Russian is being suppressed and persecuted, not only in Ukraine, but throughout the Western world. No trade, or almost no trade, with Russia. This is unacceptable. These attempts, absurd attempts to cancel Russian culture. The pieces written by Russian classical composers and the pieces of classical music are not allowed to be performed in operas and concertos and theaters. No mentioning of anything Russian. Russian artists are prohibited from appearing on stages in Western Europe and the West in general. And Russian athletes are barred under different pretexts from international competition. Unfortunately, Olympic principles have been abandoned for the sake of this narrative, anti-Russian narrative, and many other things happening, including just confiscation without any compensation of some assets, properties. Now Finland is debating a new law which would allow authorities to more easily confiscate Russian real estate in Finland, bought legitimately by Russian citizens. Now they just want to confiscate it. So this is to demonstrate the level of discrimination which has achieved its paramount, apogee point on discrimination by ethnicity on the level of law. So purely this is racial discrimination. They are not asking really if, like they used to a sportsman, tennis player, for example, do you approve or disapprove of the special military operation? And if you give a written acknowledgement that you disapprove, then the Brits will allow you to play in the Wimbledon tournament. No, this is not the case in many instances. Now, it's not required. Russians are being discriminated simply by the mere fact that they feel they belong to the Russian world. They speak Russian, even if they have a passport nationality by some other country, and they have not they do not enjoy Russian citizenship. So just that the kids are discriminated at schools and kindergartens and students in the universities, this is the end of the tolerant, pluralistic, democratic Western civilization. What's going on is the struggle for a new multipolar world, and I'm very happy that I can state without any reservations that Russia and South Africa shares this view that the world is moving to a multipolarity from unipolarity, unipolar order established on some kinds of rules-based order, and that this process, and it is a process, it's a long process, it is not only confined to strategic global security, but it is also very important on the economic side. The dominant position, the unique position of US dollar as world's reserve currency has to be dealt with somehow, and the system of global governance institutions should be reviewed, because they were designed to ensure domination of just one part of this world. And all these elements, they move in the right direction, and this is an objective process. And it is happening, and it will happen, it will end in result in multipolarity regardless of the SMO in Ukraine. We would rather be doing without it, but it so happened that we had to. We were compelled to take this decision, as our president said many times on many occasions. But this is what is at stake. This is what Ukrainians mean. This is what General Ben Hodges, the former commander of US troops in Europe, had in mind apparently when he said that there is so much at stake than just Ukraine. It is about the emergence of a multipolar world, and unfortunately we have to do it this way, by paying this price, not peacefully. But that was not our choice. Because the unipolar world is doing everything it can to resist this evolution, And on many occasions, many US officials and Western officials said that this is an existential fight for them as well. Why? If not because of this, as I described, then why? We do not threaten their existence. We do not want war. We do not want Ukrainian territory. And President Putin said again very clearly, I formulated it in a very, very clear way, that Russia is one of the biggest countries, the biggest actually country by surface in the world, and we didn't need to fight for somebody else's territory. But we cannot afford not to provide assistance to Russians. Again, I'm going back to Ukraine, because Ukrainian officials said on many occasions that they will root out everything Russian in the territories that they are going to return by military force. They are going to exterminate Russian population in these territories. So it will be very difficult for us to leave ethnic Russians in this situation. But that was, conquering territories was not the purpose, and is not the purpose. And nobody is going to menace the existence of other states, including in the West, who are not our partners anymore, but rather opponents or enemies. And it is the situation that they created themselves. And now some people, at least in some countries, start realizing what's going on really, and feeling the effects of different policies implemented by their governments and parliaments, and start asking questions about the wisdom of this action, effectiveness, about the real nature of the real interests that are behind it. But it is, for the Ukrainians, it is already too late, and we just hope that it won't be too late for others, that the conflict should stop there. There are signs, though, that there are so many foreign fighters, mercenaries in Ukraine, and I mean, I don't know where the engagement by the Western powers will end in this. They provide intel, they provide training, they provide arms and ammunition, they basically pay for Ukrainian state apparatus. Where is the end to this involvement? How far can they go? Now it was a short introduction. now there is questions and answers session. I mean, you could have interrupted me at any moment.
Thank you so much, firstly, for the opportunity, and I greet you, Your Excellency. My name is Lindo Buhle, and I'm representing LN24 SA. The question that firstly, I have multiple questions, but I suppose one of the pressing questions based on the discussion we've just had, or rather your presentation, is that the US Republican presidential debates have already commenced, and of course among the issues that are discussed is how to address the conflict in Ukraine. And some presidential candidates, like Chris Christie as well as Nikki Haley, insist that the United States should continue its participation in the conflict in Ukraine, because apparently, according to them, Ukraine is literally the remaining wall against what they say is Russian aggression, as well as the collapse of democracy. However, His Excellency, President Putin, in his annual keynote speech at the Valdai Discussion Club this year in Sochi, addressed the United States, and he stated that the era where the West coerced countries into compromising decisions or positions is over. And he went on to question the United States, asking, what right do you have to warn anyone? Now, based on all that you have discussed this evening, is the remarks from the President of Russia a hint into Russia's plans on how to approach diplomacy with the West, and especially the United States, in the coming year?
Thank you for the presentation. But what I'd like to ask with regards to Russia's view, and in conjunction with BRICS that has happened, in conjunction with Africa and Asian countries, what is clear is that this conflict will not end diplomatically. Post-Munich Minsk Accord 2, which collapsed, and with the current belligerence from the side of the West, it is clear that this will end, it has to end militarily. Now, what is Russia's position, BRICS position, with regards to the multipolar side of it, with regards to engagement in terms of economically with countries in terms like Africa and Asia, parallel to what is happening, which has to go to the full throttle? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for the history lesson. It was appreciated. But what we find to be interesting as the people in the street is that the same countries that were major players in the scramble for Africa are the same countries that have formulated the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization. We are not for a moment deceived by the West. It doesn't matter what stand they are pulling there in the Ukraine. They've been here for 200 years oppressing us. We are not for a moment deceived by them. We know who they are. But our question now is that why is Russia pushing us away? It's like you don't want us to be part of this conflict. You don't want us to come with solutions. And we know them. Their cards are overplayed. We're just waiting now for a Hollywood movie where they will present themselves as the heroes as usual. You know, they invade a country, they kill the people, they steal the minerals, and then they produce a movie whereby we know what they do, we know what they are capable of. Some people are saying Russia has overreacted in keeping NATO away from Russia. If Africa had overreacted in the 1800s, we wouldn't have any colonial history right now. If China doesn't react against the presence of NATO in the South China Sea, they will have colonial history. Tell the people of Russia to stand with Mr. President, with their president, stand with their leaders. Thank you.
The countries that are championing multilateralism, is there discussions between these countries and the United States to get the United States to shift with the rest of the world, or the United States is being sidelined?
Thank you for the questions. They are not easy ones, but it's difficult for me, not being a specialist on North America, to comment about the nuances of the electoral campaign in the United States. Yes, but some people say that, including presidential hopefuls, that U.S. should continue supplying Ukraine, assisting Ukraine. And actually, I think that in the Western world in general, as a whole, the promises to assist Ukraine as much, as long as it takes, this is a quotation, are predominant. The other voices, other opinions are being sounded. Opposite opinions are being sounded more and more frequently, but they are still in clear minority. Now, the establishment, the ruling elites are still there. They still stick to this notion that they should help Ukraine as much as possible, except for sending their troops. Their soldiers should not be dying in Ukraine. It's somebody else. Ukrainians, first of all, then, well, a bunch of volunteers, mercenaries. There are several private military companies and military organizations that operate in Ukraine. On Ukrainian side, well, this is a private business according to this logic, and it's fine if several dozen British, German, Romanian and other troops, Poles actually, there are several thousand of Poles that are dead already, who perished in Ukraine for some crazy Ukrainian ultra-nationalist and Nazi ideas. Well, it's their choice. But what is important is that the West so far didn't make it obvious that it wants its troops to engage directly with the Russian military. So the policy is that any kind of assistance, but not the coffins coming to these countries under the flags, national flags, with the dead bodies of their soldiers. Pretty cynical to me. These slogans that the West should continue helping Ukraine, United States or someone else should keep helping Ukraine, it's difficult for me to say, in fact, how honest, how sincere are they. Perhaps some people really believe that it's in their best interests to harm Russia as much as possible, so angry Russians vote out the current regime, so the country can be dismembered, or in some other way its sovereignty can be taken away and resources plundered. It's very difficult to say. Maybe they really believe so, but I mean, this is defeatist policy. We will prevail, we will win, because we know what we're fighting for, and majority of the population is supporting Russia. By no means we're trying to alienate anybody or push aside. And there are countries who are aggressively anti-Russian, and there are countries that openly support us, and then there are countries with a very wide range of and all kinds of nuances that they say that they want to be equally distanced, that they are not supporting either side in this conflict, and so on. So we respect all positions, and of course we try to make more friends, and we try to explain that basically what's happening is in the interest of the most of humanity. It is against the interest of the West. But the Western dominance that lasted for 500 years or so and was based mostly on the military advantage and technological advantages is over. Other countries, other nations learn to use global economy benefits to their advantage. And this is why actually the bodies, institutions of global governance are becoming less and less relevant for the West, like WTO, for example, World Trade Organization. Well, hopefully more people will understand the underlying, rather complex, I have to admit, it took me such a long time to explain the very fundamental, actually not all, but few elements of the history and all kinds of reasons and circumstances that led to the special military operation. And hopefully these people will have influenced their governments, and we will start winning all kinds of votes in the United Nations, UN Security Council, and other organizations. But well, so far we are where we are. Now, there is no such thing as a common BRICS positions. BRICS is not an alliance, once again. It's not military alliance. It's not political alliance. It's a formation of states that coordinate with each other, that try to agree on as many issues of significance to them as possible, but that doesn't mean that there should be necessarily a common BRICS position on Ukraine or something like that. No. This is not the purpose of the BRICS. And we respect each other very much exactly for the capacity to take independent and sovereign decisions, both internally and in terms of foreign policy, and with full respect to sovereignty of each other. We discuss very different matters.
There are two observations I want to make. One, I know that the two Minsk agreements were not honored as per Angela Merkel. There was one agreement that was entered into, I think, a month after the war started, which was disrupted by Boris Johnson. The Africa mission for that peace was only made aware when President Putin revealed the Eastern agreement that was disrupted. What I want to know is, what is the status of that agreement that was signed, which Boris Johnson prevailed upon Zelensky not to honor? Number two is, one of the triggers of the warrant of arrest for President Putin was around the children. If I could have a clarity of what exactly happened for there to be a charge that there are children that have been kidnapped, for which there's a war crime committed for President Putin to be arrested by the ICC.
Objectives of the special military operations are two: the demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. We see the demilitarization of Ukraine through the actions that the Russian army is taking. The question is, when and how will the denazification of Ukraine be implemented? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions again. Of course, this attempt to nip the conflict in its very inception, at a very early stage, I mean in March and early April 2022, is worth mentioning. The text, as you know, I mean the person who asked the question, you obviously know, it was almost, it was an elaborate text that provided for security guarantees to Ukraine, and actually provided for its territorial integrity. Yet again, I have to mention that. It is very interesting, because this is what seems to be now one of the most, but perhaps the most important point and condition on which the Ukrainian side would agree to end the conflict. It provided for the certain guarantees to Ukraine but already, of course, without Crimea and without Donetsk and Lugansk, because a few days prior to SMO, we, meaning Russian Federation, have officially recognized their independence. So there was no turning back on that, and there is no turning back on that. But otherwise, everything else was possible. And Ukraine guaranteed the neutral status, basically the non-belonging to any military bloc. Actually, in the Declaration of the Independence of Ukraine that goes back to 1991, there is such provision. It was their international legal obligation that they had violated once, at least. So if you look at this treaty, this agreement, from the perspective of these days, it can seem very, very respectable, dignified outcome for Ukrainian side. I'm afraid that the longer it goes on, the less they will have. But demilitarization doesn't mean that they shouldn't have had an army, national army. It should be just of the size and with the arms that wouldn't threaten, wouldn't be considered a strategic threat to Russia. And denazification was almost agreed, that the Nazi ideology was supposed to be prohibited constitutionally, that they were supposed to change their constitution in this respect, to prohibit Nazi ideology and Nazi ultra-right and ultra-nationalist parties and organizations were supposed to be prohibited in Ukraine. And the only remaining point was about the heritage of Stefan Bandera and Roman Shukevich, because we consider them Nazi collaborators, and basically the modern ideology is built on what they have said and have done to enhance Ukrainian nationalism. That was to be negotiated, but you know that high-ranking officials went to Istanbul to sign the agreement already. And then in the morning, Ukrainian delegation appeared at the negotiations in the negotiating room, and after lunch they disappeared. They didn't come back simply. The agreement was paraphied. There is such a term in treaty law. It was signed by some negotiators, by the chief negotiators, at the bottom of every page. It was not signed as such by two sides, two signatures at the very end of the text. But it was almost finalized. And then again, Ukrainian delegation disappeared from Istanbul, and on the, I think, 3rd or 4th of April, Boris Johnson, as you have rightly mentioned him, appeared in Kiev, and you know, to bring this opinion, which was, as we suspect, predominantly Anglo-Saxon, that Ukraine should keep fighting, and that they promise every possible assistance to Ukraine in this fight. And that really was a turnaround for Ukraine, and we are where we are. More than 500,000 dead on their side, and so on. Now, for the kids, this is a completely falsified pretext, but you know, very carefully and thoughtfully chosen one, because public opinion is always very sensitive to such issues as kids' plight in armed conflicts and so on. But what was done was exactly the opposite of which our president and his ombudsman on children's rights are accused of. The kids, several hundred kids, were taken from the territory, because you remember it switched hands in the south in particular, and some children from orphanages under tutorship, with tutors who refused to go on with them, who could not do that. Some estranged kids who were lost in fighting, in all these kinds of evacuations and movements of people, and the military personnel, and abandoned, left alone somehow, they were all taken out of the area where actually fighting took place or could take place. And they were put to the best children's facilities that we have, in particular in Crimea, like those who studied in the USSR remember these pioneer camps, these kids summer facilities, exactly so they could keep being educated. They could continue schooling. Of course, the programs are very different in Russia and Ukraine, but according to Russian curriculum. So just to save them, and nobody prevented them from going back, and dozens of kids were returned to their families, who addressed either Russian authorities or the authorities mostly in the so-called new territories. And Red Cross has assisted with that, I think. So it was done in the best interests of the children. And the process is going on. Kids are being returned to the families. Just recently, Ukrainian side announced that 2 more have been returned. And nobody is kidnapping anybody. We don't need to kidnap any kids. Why would we need that? Then let me make some publicity to some Russian authors. We will distribute, you will find that here on the table a few issues of this alternative viewpoint compilation. It is a compilation of the articles on the different aspects of SMO in Ukraine, on international diplomacy, on different acute issues that we have written, myself and my colleagues, and were published mostly in Pretoria News, but in different newspapers of the independent media. So please, if you're interested, there will be some copies of this compilation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We have a token of appreciation which will be presented by the former Gauteng former MEC for Rural and Agriculture and Social Development, currently the Executive Director of Castro and Modica Mayatula Foundation, Me Nandi Mayatula Khoza.
Thank you very much to the program directors. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you, especially Mr. Duma, for inviting all of us to this colloquium on changing geopolitical dynamics. And I'd like to acknowledge His Excellency, the Ambassador of Russian Federation to South Africa and the Kingdom of Lesotho, Mr. Rokachev, thank you very, very much. And let me also acknowledge members of the diplomatic corps who are with you, the veteran journalists who are here, and the current journalists of our country and our nation, in our continent. Comrades and friends, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nandimaya Tulakoza. I'm the daughter of one of those who was part of the Umcimbi that was spoken about earlier, the late Reverend Castromaya Tulakoza, who was also a board member of one of the most progressive newspapers in our country in the past, The Voice. But I'm currently I've been MSs for many departments, but I'm currently now plowing back to the community in various ways, serving with Mr. Duma in the board of directors of the Mayatullah Foundation. My task is the easiest. I've been requested really to, express our appreciation to His Excellency the Ambassador for, the history that you have given us. In one of our corners, we call it Umkhabulo. I know you won't be able to pronounce it. We call it Umkhabulo. You've really shared with us the history. You reflected on the historical and current situation between Russia and Ukraine. You gave us more than what we read about. In fact, it's better to listen to you than to read the newspapers. Thank you for interrogating the reality and the truth of what has happened and what is happening, and we are very much well informed. So I'm not giving a vote of thanks, but I'm here to present a gift of appreciation, a small token of appreciation. I'm going to ask Mr. Duma to do it, as he's the one who basically organized this colloquium. To basically remind you that in Africa we have the Big Five. So it's an artistic display of the Big Five, and remember to rest and go to one of our well-renowned national parks. Thank you very much.
Let me, for you to preserve the best memories of this event, I'll give you the traditional Russian doll that is hidden one in another. You can go on and on. A matryoshka. And Mr. Duma, for you, the jigsaw puzzle of with a view of cathedral, Orthodox Christian cathedral in St. Petersburg. It looks very much like the St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, but it's not. It's a different one.
Thank you.